Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Don Grothoff, family coach with FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com. In the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast series, I delve into the hidden characteristics of OCD, anxiety, and anxiety disorders. The things that most people don't see, that are behind closed doors and shut within the mind about anxiety. My goal with these podcasts is to bring about awareness of Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, or OCD. Understand that I am not a doctor, therapist, or counselor, and the content, information, resources, and ideas that are talked about and brought up here in these podcasts are things that I have used, discovered, or have been recommended to me, and I always recommend to seek additional professional help in finding solutions for yourself. Thank you for listening and enjoy the podcast. This podcast was recorded May 19th, 2017. This is podcast number 9, called Will They Call DSS? Last podcast we talked about the 5 speeds of the brain. In this podcast I want to really talk about the stress that parents go through when they're dealing with traumas in the home. And not just in the home, but when you leave home and when you take that trauma or the possibility of trauma with you when you go shopping, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to a movie theater, whatever it might be when you're out in public and you have to deal with a child or a person who can have meltdowns, panic attacks in the middle of a crowd. You know, when they're dealing with OCD or other dramatic, disorders, battles, fights, loud noises, can be a regular thing at home, but also when you get out into the world, out into the streets. The thing that goes through the mind of a parent, and again I know this from personal experience, is will they call DSS, the Department of Social Services? And will that, because you run rampant in the mind with, will they call DSS? Will they come out? Will they take my child away? Will they possibly arrest me? All of those things go through your mind when you have a child that becomes very noisy, very loud, screams, yells, when they threaten to kill themselves loudly, when they scream at the top of their lungs. And you just, the mind of the parent goes through this process of wondering what the neighbors think, what the crowd thinks when you're in Walmart when it starts happening. These kind of things play real heavily on the mind of the parent. They played heavily on my mind and my wife's mind, really on the whole family. They weigh on the whole family because not only do we concern ourselves with such things as DSS, the younger kids, the other kids, depending on their age, especially if they're in teens, worry tremendously about what that's going to mean to their respect, to their relationships with other people. So it really becomes a big part of the stress that parents go through. Again, myself and my wife dealt with a child. Actually, now dealing with a second child that has some issues too, but dealt with a child that would scream at what I always say, at octaves that are higher than the ear can perceive. I think sometimes dogs in the neighborhood were waking up by some of the screams that she could put out. And so we began that stress factor, not only the stress of what we were going through and the anxiety we were going through, the family was going through, what she was going through, but the fear of what the neighbors would think, what the people would think. we didn't have as many outside experiences with panic attacks or problems as I think some families do, because of our situation with my child, was the fact that we couldn't get my child out of the house that much because she couldn't touch anything. She couldn't sit in the car seat um, because she couldn't touch. So it was very difficult to get her out. So we didn't have as many experiences outside the home with this kind of scenario as we did in the home with her screaming, yelling, destroying things very loudly, smacking into walls, and um, we did have a couple of incidents outside of the home, and one of them happened to be in a Walmart. I remember this really well. I had to go into Walmart to get something. I can't even remember what it was at the time that we had to stop in. I was very much dreading it because I had my child with OCD with me, and I had a younger child. Uh, he At that time, my younger child was probably about 2 years old, I guess, because I can remember him sitting in the cart as we were going around Walmart, and my daughter lost it for some reason. And now my recollection doesn't bring back what it was. That triggered her, but she ran into one of her triggers that set her off, and also set her off running across the Walmart, and somewhat yelling, not real loudly, but you could panicking. And I was there with all three of my kids because my oldest was there, and I remember having to argue with him to stay with his brother, the youngest one, while I went after my daughter. And panicking in my mind, thinking, well, they're going to call the police. The guard at Walmart's going to come. What's going to happen? And I was worried about my youngest panicking in the cart. I was worried about my oldest being there and staying there with him because I was chasing after, all the while dialing my wife at work, asking her to please come. I needed help big time. I was really worried at the time of what was going to happen with my daughter and what was going to happen to us, me, them, all of it. So it was not a good scenario, but we came out of it okay because my wife did show up. I was able to kind of corral my daughter to a certain area so that she wouldn't run around. And my wife came, and there was an interesting factor in our situation, and I have not really talked about this with any of my other clients and to see whether this was something. But one thing I do notice is that there is kind of a tag team kind of scenario that happened for us where my daughter would come to a calmer place when my partner, my wife, would come, or she was in the middle of it and I would come in kind of fresh, I guess, into the situation, seemed to be able to bring her down out of that. But what it did for me in a way was to be able to respect a parent and the child, or a parent and the person, I guess, when they go through that, when I see somebody else go through a panic attack in a store, and I know, I can feel it in my heart that the parent is stressing, thinking what other people are thinking, getting comments from other people of how, or whispering under the breath of other people of how they should discipline their child better and how they shouldn't let this kind of stuff happen, and the looks that they get. I can remember some of that. And so when I am in a store or in a place of any sort and I see a child act up, I try, one, to not give those kind of looks, not make any prejudgment on it. I try to be very open to what this poor parent is going through and what the poor child or the person is going through that is having the panic attack, and trying to be empathetic, sympathetic with them. So I try to push that message out to others too, to understand what might be going on in that family's lives that is causing them problems, and try to be compassionate about it. Help if you can, but don't give advice. So, because what happens is that it's really in the imagination of the parent's mind, or the caregiver's mind, let's put it that way, of what goes on. It's almost their own imagination of all the bad things that could happen. When in most cases, I think, unless the parent is being abusive, I think authorities can understand that. So even if they were called in, if you can explain what's going on, they usually will follow the parents' thoughts, and you're not going to end up in jail. Because what's happening with the parent is that they're working from fear, and whenever you work from fear, you're working from a place that's not really giving you the full story. I always believe in the idea that fear. I always like the definition of fear: false evidence appearing real. Now, there's a couple different ones I've heard, but that's the one I've always kind of fall to. So they're probably not thinking with a clear mind, so that it's not working the best. And one of the things I used to think that telling the child, making them aware of who might be able to hear this, and I used to do it with my daughter. I used to say to her, "Do you know that the neighbors back here are hearing you scream and call for committing suicide or for help or whatever you're screaming? And do you think that that they're not being affected?" And I thought that would really help. I thought that would, and many times it would quiet her, at least for that moment. But as I learned over time, and as I learned from her, now that she's out of that and able to tell me things about OCD, she has told me that in the long run that message is not helpful, because it adds guilt to an already guilt-ridden mind of the OCD sufferer. And that it really does, when I look back, and she pointed out that it really didn't stop her. And I really believe that's true, that it really doesn't stop them, because she might stop at that moment, but within a short period of time she was right back at it. That thought process gets knocked out, and it doesn't work. It only causes long-term guilt. Also, telling the sufferer to calm down doesn't work. It doesn't register. It doesn't have an effect on them. What I do find that's effective is, first off, is the parent or the caregiver staying calm themselves. And it's very difficult to do. It's very easy to get into what they're doing and rise up with them in that anxiety. But if the parent can keep themselves at a calm level, it makes a world of difference, because the other side, the sufferer, does not raise up as far up, or they may raise up high, but it tends to bring the wind out of that sail. And so it's very important for the parent to stay calm. And that's easy to say. That's easy for me to say, because when you're in it, it's very tough. It gets the anger up. If you're tired, all of those things play into that. But even if you're tired, staying calm, it may not seem like it's the best answer, because you want to get it solved. You want to get it solved right now. You want this violence, this anger, this screaming, whatever, to stop right now. And no matter what you do, that probably is not going to happen instantaneously. And I have found, both in my own experience and working with other clients, that in staying calm and staying down in your place of anxiety, will speed up the factor of getting them to a resolution so much faster. And I teach in what I do when I work with parents, when I work with couples, I teach a method called mirroring. And I'm pretty sure I'm doing a podcast on this. But I teach a method of mirroring that helps to learn how to communicate with the other person, the sufferer of the OCD. So it's very important in staying calm. It lessens the impact. I also try to talk in a positive manner, not about that you need to stop this, this doesn't work, but trying to talk to them about you have the power within you to stop this. I know you well. I know you can do it. I know you can do this. You're very powerful. One of the things that I did with my daughter that I think had some effect, and it's kind of a twofold part, but the biggest part of it is talking about love. Because I always thought that the one thing that OCD doesn't have, and I talk about OCD kind of like it's a person, because it really feels that way. But one thing OCD doesn't understand or doesn't have is love and compassion. Because what I did with my daughter, and I've talked about it with clients too, is I talk about Harry Potter. Now, as years go by, that may fall away, but I think most kids nowadays are reading that, even though it's been, I don't know how many years since it's actually come out. But if you think about Harry Potter and his, archenemy Voldemort, there was a big thing there about what Harry had that Voldemort didn't have, and that was the love of his mother. That love that she instilled within him, that she also had, that has protected him and kept him from the powers, and actually, overall, and this might be a spoiler, but that, he overcomes Voldemort in the very end. And so, we had read all those books, so she knew that. We watched the movies after we read the books. She knew that character. And I think in some way that did kind of help her in the idea that she has something that OCD will never have, that's stronger than anything that OCD has. Even though the situation in her mind at the very beginning of it anyway, that was hard for her to conceive because the OCD was so much stronger. But the more work she did, the more ERP, exposure response prevention therapy she did, the more that OCD side became weaker and the love and her side of it became stronger. And so she could see that, and that could be used as a tool against OCD. And I think it worked. I don't know, I can't give you a percentage of its success, but I think that it really did make a difference. So I guess what I'm trying to get out in this podcast is the idea of, one is not worrying about what others think. They don't know what you're going through, and if they don't want to step into your shoes and really understand it, then I wouldn't worry about them. And I believe that any of the authorities that might be sent out, or if somebody does happen to call DSS or call the police or call an ambulance, whatever it might be, I believe that most times they're going to follow the thoughts of the parents and understand what's going on. So I want to make that clear, that stress, hopefully you can kind of let go of and get out of the fear place and get into the compassionate love place. Again, I talk about this over and over, but one of the big important things that my wife has taught me in our journey through OCD is that to have compassion. That yes, we have to have some discipline in this, and not, by discipline I don't mean spanking and all that, but structure type of discipline to do the things that need to be done, like the ERP therapy, which I talk about a lot and I coach on. It's wonderful. But we do have to have some discipline and structure in that, and be, how do you say it, resilient, strong in doing those procedures. But we can do that with a compassion and a love, remembering who we're dealing with, that this is still our child, this is still our daughter, our loving, compassionate, sweet daughter. That's what she was before the OCD, and now after we've gone through it and gotten out of it. So I think that's the message I'm trying to get across here. Is one is not to be so worried about what others think. They're going to think what they think, and you can't stop that. And I think in the long run you'll be safe from any kind of DSS factors. And again, just to be calm, go with love, and follow that pattern. Follow the heart in staying calm and compassionate. So thank you. This concludes this podcast. Please remember to leave comments for me, because that really helps me to understand what you're looking for and helps give me fodder for the next possible podcast. Also, I'd love to hear your invisible wheelchair story if you're willing to share it. If you are, feel free to go to invisiblewheelchair.com and click on Tell Your Story. Now, if you've heard these things and you feel like you need further assistance or some help in what you're going through, and you want to spend some time with me working through those issues, then feel free to book a session at focusedhealthyfamily.com or familyocd.com, or simply call me at 704-562-1630. Finally, don't forget there is a tap-in recording following this podcast you may want to take advantage of. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and will join me for the next one. Remember, keep tapping, talking, and transcending your life into new heights. Thank you, and have a great day.